So far, we've covered the official story of Oswald's journey to Mexico City, 5 witnesses who say Oswald was in Texas at the same time, and the actions that Oswald allegedly took at the Soviet and Cuban consulates. We looked at whether there were any photos or audio recordings that existed of those visits, and we read the show-stopping transcript from a phone call between J. Edgar Hoover and President Johnson the day after the assassination, where Hoover tells Johnson that Lee Harvey Oswald was impersonated in Mexico City. In this third and final episode in the Mexico City series, we look at what was going on behind the scenes at the CIA and the FBI as it relates to Mexico City. We also cover Marina's statements about Lee in Mexico, and finally, we zoom out to look at why Mexico City matters in solving the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed custody the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The commission answers he acted alone.
I'm working on I'm just a patsy.
This is Solving JFK. I'm your host, Matt Crumpton. According to the CIA, its Mexico City station witnessed Oswald enter and make phone calls to the Soviet consulate and the Cuban consulate. Given that this was the near peak of the Cold War, and Oswald was a former attempted Soviet defector who had spent August handing out Fair Play for Cuba flyers, one would think that the CIA would put 2 and 2 together and realize that the Oswald visiting the consulates in Mexico City was the same Oswald who visited the Soviet Union and supported the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. But that's not what happened. Why not? On September 23, 1963, the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, James Angleton, began to bifurcate Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA file. Specifically, the FBI reports from Oswald's time in New Orleans about his activities with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and his arrest went into a separate file instead of Oswald's normal 201 file, which is where all the information about Oswald visiting the Soviet consulate went. A few weeks later, on October 10th, 2 cables went out from the CIA to the FBI, State Department, and the Navy describing Oswald as a 6-foot-tall, 35-year-old with an athletic build. The same day, another cable was sent from Langley by Angleton's assistant, Ann Egerter, to the Mexico City station with the correct description of Oswald. That cable said that the latest information the CIA had on Oswald was a State Department memo from 1962. Because the file had been bifurcated by Angleton, none of the reports about Oswald's time in New Orleans during the summer of 1963 were sent to Mexico City. After Oswald's attempted defection to the Soviet Union in 1959, he had been given an FBI flash warning, which required any information that was learned about him to immediately be forwarded to the espionage section of the Domestic Intelligence Unit. This flash was canceled on October 9th, one day before the CIA sent the cable to the FBI. On October 18th, about a month before the assassination, the FBI sent a memo from Mexico City saying that Oswald met and spoke with Valery Kostikov, the senior consular official who handled the issuance of visas. On November 22nd, the day of the assassination, a CIA after action report says that the FBI called the CIA when Oswald's name was first mentioned on the radio. This call was then passed on to Angleton's office, and it was at this point, hours after President Kennedy had been shot, that the FBI first told the CIA that the person Oswald had met with at the Soviet consulate, Valery Kostikov, was part of the Soviet KGB's Department 13, which was responsible for assassinations in the Western Hemisphere. After such a meeting, to say that it was a colossal security failure to allow Oswald to be on the motorcade would be an understatement. Nevertheless, the official story is that Oswald met with someone from the KGB assassinations unit just 7 weeks before President Kennedy was shot, and the intelligence community did nothing to stop Oswald. On the other hand, Kostikov belonging to this assassinations unit has not been definitively established. As noted by J. Edgar Hoover in a September 15, 1964 memo to the director of the CIA, the FBI could find no information to support the idea that Kostikov was part of the KGB's Department 13. And Kostikov himself says that his interactions with Oswald were only in the course of his duties working at the Soviet consulate. Fast forwarding into the future a bit, there is a significant piece of evidence that supports the idea that Oswald really did go to Mexico City. A typewritten letter dated November 9, 1963, and mailed on November 12th, was written in English from Lee Oswald to the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. The letter starts, quote, "Dear Sirs, this is to inform you of recent events since my meeting with Comrade Kostin in the Embassy of the Soviet Union, Mexico City, Mexico." So right out of the gate, this letter makes it clear that Oswald was in Mexico City. No one who works at the Soviet consulate is named Kostin, but as we just discussed, there was a Kostikov, which is not too far off. The letter goes on to provide details of Oswald's trip to Mexico City and makes it sound like Oswald is reporting back to the USSR about what he's up to. And he's doing this just weeks before he allegedly killed President Kennedy. One confusing thing about this letter is that it says, quote, "Of course, the Soviet embassy was not at fault. They were, as I say, unprepared. The Cuban consulate was guilty of a gross breach of regulations. I am glad he has since been replaced." It appears that this letter was referencing Cuban consul Eusebio Askew, who was transferred out of Mexico City for Cuba on November 18th. But unless Oswald was told by some sort of inside source at least a week before it happened, Oswald would have had no way of knowing that Askew was about to leave his position at the time Oswald allegedly sent the letter. In 1999, a declassified document release that Russian President Boris Yeltsin provided to American President Bill Clinton shed some light on what the Soviets thought about this letter. One document says that the Soviets thought the letter from Oswald was forged to try to frame him. Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin wrote in an internal memo, quote, "This letter was clearly a provocation. It gives the impression we had close ties with Oswald and were using him for some purposes of our own." He goes on to say, quote, one gets the definite impression that the letter was concocted by those who, judging from everything, are involved in the president's assassination. Around November 10th, a handwritten draft of the final typed letter was found by Ruth Paine in her home. Paine told the Warren Commission that she never saw the typed letter and that she made a copy of it in her own handwriting. Interestingly, Ruth Paine never told Marina about the letter. Marina didn't find out about it until the FBI showed it to her on January 22, 1964. One would think that if Ruth was close enough to Marina to help her with her infant child and allow her to live at her house, then she would have wanted to let Marina know that Lee was writing to the Soviet embassy about being in Mexico City. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen. One obvious question that we have not yet looked at when it comes to Mexico City is, what did Marina have to say about it? We've seen that Marina Oswald's testimony is somewhat inconsistent when it comes to the backyard photos, the General Walker shooting, and Oswald's rifle ownership. Still, it's useful to know what she said on the record. According to the Warren report, Marina said that Lee admitted being in Mexico City and told her that the process of trying to get to Cuba was full of red tape and bureaucrats. The Warren report accurately points out that Marina Oswald admitted that Lee went to Mexico City. But what the report doesn't tell us is that before Marina said that Lee did go to Mexico City, she had previously denied knowing anything about him going to Mexico City on 8 different occasions. Immediately after the assassination, the Secret Service asked Marina if Lee came back with her from New Orleans. She responded, quote, "No, he did not come back with me. He remained in New Orleans for another 2 weeks in hopes that he would find another job, and then he came to Dallas." On November 29th, 5 days after her husband had been killed, Marina reiterated to FBI agents Heitman and Boguslav that Oswald had planned to remain in New Orleans to find work. Marina then volunteered the information that, to her knowledge, Oswald had never been in Mexico because she figured the FBI was interested in knowing that since she saw it mentioned on TV. On December 5th, Marina said that Lee never mentioned that he was making plans to go to Cuba, and he said nothing to her about going to Mexico or Cuba when she in June left New Orleans with Ruth Paine in September. On December 10th, Secret Service agent Leon Gopadze interviewed Marina and wrote the following in his report, quote, "Concerning Lee Oswald's being in Mexico City, Marina Oswald stated that she had no prior knowledge of him going to Mexico City." The next day, December 11th, Marina was again interviewed by the Secret Service, and again, for the 5th time, confirmed that she had no prior knowledge of her husband going to Mexico City. On January 16, 1964, Marina told FBI agents Heitman and Boguslav once again that she did not know that Oswald had been to Mexico before he came to Dallas. The next day, January 17th, Marina told the same FBI agents that, quote, "Oswald had not told her anything whatsoever about any intentions on his part to go to Mexico." Marina also said that Oswald never told her about being in Mexico City and that she found out about him going there, quote, "from television programs at Dallas immediately following the assassination of President Kennedy." On January 22nd, Marina said that she had seen an English-Spanish dictionary at Ruth Paine's house that belonged to Lee, and that Lee gave her a coin with a hole in it that had Spanish writing on it. Of course, both of those items, while highly circumstantial, would point to Oswald potentially being in Mexico. But Marina still maintained that she did not know that Lee had been to Mexico. Then, on February 3rd, Marina Oswald's answers about whether she knew anything about her husband's alleged trip to Mexico City suddenly changed. On that day, she told the Warren Commission, quote, "I knew that Lee would go to Mexico City, but of course, I didn't tell Mrs. Payne about it." She said that Oswald had discussed in advance with her that he was going to Mexico, adding, quote, "From Mexico City, he wanted to go to Cuba. Perhaps through the Russian embassy in Mexico, somehow he would be able to get to Cuba." When the Warren Commission asked Marina to explain her about face on the topic of whether she knew her husband was in Mexico City, she said, quote, "Most of these questions were put to me by the FBI. I do not like them too much. I didn't want to be too sincere with them, though I was quite sincere and answered most of their questions. They questioned me a great deal, and I was very tired of them, and I thought that, well, whether I knew about it or didn't know about it didn't change matters at all. It didn't help anything, because the fact that Lee had been there was already known. Whether or not I knew about it didn't make any difference." Something else happened around the time when Marina changed her story regarding her husband's trip to Mexico City. Sometime in February of 1964, Marina finalized a deal with Texi Italia Films to sell the rights to her life story, for which she was paid $75,000. The equivalent of about $750,000 today. The film rights to Marina's life story were never used. I couldn't find much on Texi Italia other than what Baylor University has online in the John Armstrong collection. It looks like the company was kicked out of their offices in February of 1964 for failure to pay rent after having rented a space there for exactly 1 year. There's no smoking gun of this payment being a bribe to get Marina to change her tune. People buy the rights for movies that don't get made all the time. Still, it would be nice to learn more about the people behind Texi Italia so that we can rule out that this contract was not legit. I'd also like to know how Texi Italia could afford the money to buy the rights from Marina Oswald. At the same time, they couldn't afford to pay the rent at their office. While there seems to be a lot of confusion from Marina about her husband in Mexico City, the phone number for the Cuban consulate was found in Oswald's address book, as was the number for the Soviet military attaché. A Mexican coin and an English to Spanish dictionary was also found. Not to mention the letter to the Soviet Union that Oswald allegedly wrote in November. There's not an innocent misunderstanding here. Either Oswald really did go to Mexico City and he was impersonated by someone in Texas, or Oswald did not go to Mexico City and he was impersonated there. Either way, the 5 sightings of Oswald in Texas when he should have been in Mexico, as we discussed in the first part of this series, proves that there was someone intentionally impersonating Oswald somewhere. There's conflicting evidence about what Oswald himself said regarding Mexico City. Harry Holmes, the Dallas postal inspector and FBI confidential informant who was present at the Sunday morning interrogation of Oswald, said that Oswald did admit to going to Mexico City. Also, Dallas detective L.C. Graves said, quote, "I believe Oswald did admit going to Mexico." Still, Captain Fritz's report tells a different story. He says that Oswald told interrogators that he had not been to Mexico City when he was asked. Silvia Duran, the woman who Oswald interacted with at the Cuban consulate, provided a 10-page statement confirming that Lee Harvey Oswald was the person that she had spoken with, and then gave that statement to the CIA, who gave it to the Warren Commission in May of 1964. But the story of how that statement originated calls its veracity into question. While Duran did eventually admit that she saw Lee Harvey Oswald at the Cuban consulate, that statement was the result of Duran being arrested on November 23rd, the day after the assassination, and then being beaten and tortured by the Mexican secret police. A declassified HSCA memo on Silvia Duran says, quote, "The Central Intelligence Agency determined that it would ask the Mexican government, whom it had a good relationship with, to arrest Silvia Duran because she might shed some light on the circumstances surrounding the assassination. The CIA's Mexico City station sent a note to Luis Echeverria, the Minister of the Interior, requesting that he arrest Silvia Duran immediately. The CIA then made it easy for the Mexican government to find Duran by giving Echeverria her address, her mother's address, her brother's address, her license plate number, her home phone number, and her place of work. This request to arrest Duran was not authorized by the CIA headquarters. Langley had asked the Mexico City station to not have Duran arrested, but Station Chief Wen Scott sent a wire that said it was too late. The Mexican secret police tried to pressure Duran into admitting that she had an affair with Oswald. They probably asked her that because on the Monday after President Kennedy was killed, Gilberto Alvarado Ugarte claimed that he saw a man in the Cuban consulate hand Lee Harvey Oswald $6,500 cash. He then heard the man with the money say, quote, "I want to kill the man." And he heard Oswald respond, quote, "You're not man enough. I can do it." The embassy employees turned this man over to the CIA. When they did, Alvarado told the CIA that he saw Silvia Duran embrace Oswald and give him her home phone number. So that's where the questions to Duran about the affair with Oswald come from. But it turns out that Alvarado was not telling the truth about seeing Oswald with Duran. This is because the day that he was in the Cuban embassy was September 18th, when Oswald was still in New Orleans. Alvarado admitted this after the FBI confronted him about why he failed the polygraph exam so badly. It turns out that Alvarado was an FBI informant who was also a Nicaraguan intelligence agent. Eventually, after multiple arrests and interrogations, Silvia Duran signed a 10-page statement where she said that the same Lee Harvey Oswald who killed President Kennedy visited her in the Cuban embassy. But when researcher Anthony Summers interviewed Duran in the late 1970s, she told him, quote, "I was not sure if it was Oswald or not. The man on the film is not like the man I saw here in Mexico City." There's a November 27th cable from the Mexico City CIA station chief to Langley that underlines the extent to which the CIA encouraged the Mexican secret police to get this statement from Duran. The memo says, quote, "Given the apparent character of Silvia Duran, there would appear to be good chance of her cracking when confronted with details of the reported deal, the alleged $6,500 bribe, between Oswald and the Cuban consulate officials, as reported by Alvarado. If she did break under interrogation, and we suggest Mexicans should be asked to go all out in seeking that she does, we and the Mexicans would have the needed corroboration of the statement of Alvarado. This quote makes it clear that Silvia Duran really was under duress, which, as it turned out, was being applied by the CIA. If Oswald did go to Mexico City, is there any other reason for him to be there aside from wanting to go sightseeing in Cuba for 2 weeks before he went on to the Soviet Union? There are declassified CIA documents that point to that possibility. On September 16, 1963, the CIA informed the FBI in a memo that it was, quote, giving consideration to countering fair play for Cuba in foreign countries. Is it possible that Oswald's goal was to further discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, just as he had been doing in New Orleans? Or maybe it was just a coincidence that someone named Oswald showed Fair Play for Cuba credentials in Mexico City 9 days after a memo saying that the CIA was going to try to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in foreign countries. After all, Oswald showed this FPCC card at the Cuban consulate. If not Lee Harvey Oswald 9 days later, who else could be out there discrediting the FPCC abroad? To further complicate matters, a document was mistakenly disclosed by the CIA in 1985 that says that on September 17, 1963, the day after the memo about the CIA countering the Fair Play for Cuba Committee abroad, Lee Harvey Oswald got a Mexican tourist card in New Orleans. The person who was directly in front of Oswald in line was CIA agent William Gaudet. But perhaps it was just a coincidence that Oswald stood in line behind a CIA agent to get his Mexican tourist card the day after the memo about countering Fair Play for Cuba abroad was written by the CIA. The Warren Report says that Oswald left Mexico City by bus on the morning of October 2nd and arrived in Dallas around 2:20 on October 3rd. But there was some uncertainty on the exact details. On February 12, 1964, J. Lee Rankin of the Warren Commission wrote a letter to FBI Director Hoover that said, quote, although Mexican Immigration Service records both show that he entered Mexico at Nuevo Laredo on September 26th and left Mexico on October 3rd, neither the list of persons entering Mexico on September 26th nor the list of persons departing Mexico on October 3rd shows his name. Yet both lists are purportedly complete. So there is a list of people coming and going into Mexico, but Lee Harvey Oswald is not on that list for the days that he allegedly came and went. But it's possible that Oswald didn't travel by bus, because the list that Oswald was not on only included people who were riding on a bus. A March 12, 1964 memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the legal attaché at Mexico City says, quote, until we can prove Oswald was on a bus, this possibility will always exist that he left by automobile as indicated in Mexican immigration records. When it comes to Lee Harvey Oswald and Mexico City, there are basically two camps. Those who believe Oswald was impersonated and did not go to Mexico City, and those who believe that Oswald was meeting with someone who handled assassinations on behalf of the Soviet Union. If either one of these scenarios is true, it's a big deal. An Oswald impersonation would likely mean that he was being set up by the CIA, and an Oswald visit with Kostikov, if he really was the head of assassinations in the Western Hemisphere, would potentially point the finger at the Soviet Union for the assassination of President Kennedy. And if the Soviet Union was involved in killing the American president, it would require a nuclear strike from the United States, which would result in the Soviets responding in kind and the loss of tens of millions of American lives. After being notified of the supposed Oswald visits to the Soviet and Cuban consulates in Mexico City, and after being told by Hoover that Oswald was being impersonated, President Johnson still used Oswald's supposed Mexico City consulate meetings as a pretext to get some of the Warren commissioners to join the commission, most notably Senator Richard Russell and Chief Justice Earl Warren. After Senator Russell told President Johnson that he had no interest serving on the commission with Earl Warren, Johnson said this to him in a recorded phone call.
Dick, it's already been announced, and you can serve with anybody for the good of America. And this is a question that has a good many more ramifications than on the surface. And we got to take this out of the arena where they're testifying that Khrushchev and Castro did this and did that, and kicking us into a war that can kill 40 million Americans in an hour. And you'd put on your uniform in a minute.
When President Johnson says, "You put on your uniform in a minute," to me, it sounds like what he means is do what your president is telling you to do to serve your country and to reach the outcome that will keep us out of nuclear war. Johnson went on to explain to Senator Russell the nature of the work that he would be doing on the commission.
Now, all you're going to do is evaluate a Hoover report he's already made. But
Don't move that fast, don't it?
well, okay, well then we won't move any faster than you want to move. But you're gonna lend your name to this thing because you're head of the CIA committee in the Senate.
I'm not clear on why Senator Russell being the head of the CIA committee has anything to do with Oswald killing President Kennedy. But after Russell continued to protest the idea of Earl Warren being on the committee, President Johnson said this.
Well, you want me to tell you the truth? You know what happened? Do you know what happened? Bobby and them went up to see him today, and he turned him down cold and said no.
Yeah?
2 hours later, I called him and ordered him down here, and he didn't want to come. I insisted he come. He came down here, and he told me no twice. And I just pulled out what Hoover told me about the little incident in Mexico City, and I said, now, I don't want Mr. Khrushchev to be told tomorrow and be testifying before camera that he killed this fella and that Castro killed him. And all I want you to do is look at the facts and bring any other facts you want in here and determine who killed the president. And I think you'd put on your uniform, World War I, fat as you are, and do anything you could to save one American life. And I'm surprised that you, the Chief Justice of the United States, would turn me down. And he started crying. He said, well, I won't turn you down. I'll just do whatever you say.
What's telling about President Johnson's conversations with Senator Russell and Chief Justice Warren is that he only shared a portion of the story of what Hoover told him. The part about Oswald visiting with the Soviet and Cuban consulates. But conspicuously absent from President Johnson's retelling of what Hoover told him about Mexico City is any mention at all of Oswald being impersonated and the man on the tape and in the photos not being Oswald. At a minimum, an explanation is required for the fact that President Johnson failed to mention that Hoover told him that Oswald was being impersonated in Mexico City when Johnson used Hoover's name to drive home the idea that Oswald could be connected to the Soviets. That's a startling omission, and it suggests to me that President Johnson was deceiving Chief Justice Warren and Senator Russell. Next time on Solving JFK, we'll have a recap and rebuttals episode for Mexico City and then turn our attention to Oswald's return to Dallas in the fall of 1963. If you heard anything that you believe is out of context, or if you have additional information to offer, you can let us know at solvingjfkpodcast@gmail.com. Please provide citations to the record for any fact that you're relying on. For transcripts, sources, and official podcast merchandise, visit solvingjfkpodcast.com.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Thanks for listening. Visit solvingjfkpodcast.com for more information.
I'm just